All right, so hey everyone, what's up? Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever the heck you are, whatever you're doing. Hey, I'm so glad that you took some time for us today. So, have you ever talked to an engineer who actually knows how to sell? Yeah, no, there aren't a lot of them, but the ones that can are fantastic. They're very, very unique. And today we get to talk to engineer turned salesman Mike Adams. Mike taught himself storytelling while selling and managing sales teams throughout the world for international corporations Schlumberger, Siemens, Nokia, and Halliburton. With each industry change landing him on the wrong side of a steep learning curve, Mike's learned to seek out and share specific persuasive stories. And now he finds stories and teaches storytelling for a consulting base as diverse as international as his own sales career. He's married with 3 sons and he lives in Melbourne, Australia. And he is the author of the new fantastic book, 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell. And I'm just delighted that he's here. How you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing well. It's early in the morning in Melbourne, I have to say.
I bet it is. How early? What time is it?
It is 3 a.m.
You are a trooper, man. When I moved this, I knew that I was hosing you. I'm sorry, Mike. Thank you for doing that for me, though, buddy.
It's quite okay. It's quite okay. I just take the slot when I get the slot. That's no problem for me.
Awesome. Well, you're terrific, man. So engineer turned salesman. So you got to tell me why the shift? Why the shift? I mean, most engineers are pretty darn introverted, and when they say sales, they throw up in their mouth a lot and throw up on other people even more. So what the heck, dude?
Exactly so. Exactly so. I was working in the United Kingdom in the oil and gas industry, Phil. I was actually the company I was working for is Schlumberger. We were selling software to oil and gas companies. I was on this fancy new bit of software called a neural network, which didn't work at all in 1996. In fact, we gave up. But my boss called me into his office. He said, "Mike, we've got this fantastic career opportunity for you," which in big corporations means the job that nobody else wants to do, right?
Yep.
And it was to go to Norway from London and be a salesperson. And I was like, love to go to Norway, don't want to be a salesperson. And what I said was, can't go because my wife is 8 months pregnant. And then I went home that night and she said, "Oh, we're going to Norway." So,
awesome. That excuse failed, huh?
Correct. So she flew on the last day that she was legally allowed on the plane. And our second son, Isaac, was born in the public hospital in Stavanger in Norway because there's no private hospitals in socialist Norway. Well, there weren't in 1996 anyway. So yeah, that's how I got into sales, because I wanted to go to Norway. And
or your wife wanted to go to Norway, right?
True. Well, I did too. I just didn't want to be in sales.
That's awesome.
And I would have gone back to engineering pretty quickly, I think, Phil, because I didn't really want to be in that role, but I had this amazing piece of good luck. I sold from Stavanger, Norway, the biggest corporate worldwide deal of our software that year, in my rookie year, by accident. And it truly was good fortune, because I just happened to meet exactly the right guy. There happened to be a global conference of all of the data software managers in Stavanger that year. And my client that I met got up on stage, and he was a fabulous actor, and he just presented our software, brand new software, to like 40 guys from what was Elf, now Total, one of the world's largest oil companies. And they bought it, and of course, I thought I was good. I thought I was good at selling. It took me about 15 years to realize that I just had the most outrageous stroke of good fortune, But sometimes that's enough to get you in, right?
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, especially with timing, right?
Well, that's what Napoleon said. Give me generals that are lucky. And in this game of sales, a little bit of good fortune doesn't hurt,
Awesome. That's so true. So true, man. So I gotta ask though. So you pivot from engineering into sales.
Yes.
And then you realize that there's some storytelling here. So I thought salespeople were salespeople. They should really be storytellers. Tell me why.
I'm not exactly sure how I figured that out. I started off. I went from sales and I went to marketing. And I had this job. I had to run a conference of 400 of our clients coming to Prague in the Czech Republic, what was Czechoslovakia then. And I got the job of 1 hour time slot to present this brand new software to them. And I was smart enough to know that an hour is too long for a software demo for like 400 people, and there were managers. And what I decided to do was write a play and get 5 of my marketing people to act out this play for about 40 minutes and then take questions. And the questions went for an hour after the slot, you know, through the coffee break and whatever. And the audience just loved it. And all the characters stayed in part. And it was a really interesting experience. And that was when I kind of figured that the drama was really compelling. And then I slowly just cut the length down until we were just doing, you know, 1 or 2 minute anecdotes. And what I teach these days is really anecdotes. It's just little 1-2 minute anecdotes, but of a particular type at a particular time in the buying cycle. So the 7 stories are, what are the stories to help build rapport and create trust at the beginning of the buying cycle? What are the stories that help get new ideas across and change the mind of your buyer, because you have to change their mind? And then most importantly, what are the stories that help reduce the perception of risk and get them across the line to sign the contract? Because as you know, that can still be, you know, extremely difficult, particularly with big deals, you know. And through my career, I worked on really big deals, you know, multi-$100-million deals. And and if there's anything special about me, Phil, it's not, I don't think that I was a fabulous salesperson. I had my wins and losses like everybody, but I had to change industry. When I came back to Australia from Europe, we actually worked in Russia and all over Europe, and I worked a lot in Southeast Asia as well. But we had to come home. My dad wasn't well. We decided to live in Melbourne, and there's no oil and gas industry there. You know, I was essentially forced after 17 years to change industry, and so I kind of reworked my CV and presented myself as a salesperson, because that was like the transferable skill. And that experience taught me really to be purposeful about the storytelling, because you don't know anything and you have to sell something in a short period of time. You know, probably as a rookie salesperson who supposedly knows how to sell, but you don't know the industry, you don't know your products and services, you don't know your client, that was my situation. You need stories, because you don't have time really to learn the technical language. You just need the stories. And that was where I got really purposeful about it, and that worked. And eventually I changed industry 4 more times. Well, 5 if you count being a sales trainer these days. So that was where I kind of figured out there was a technique here. Whereas I think most really good salespeople do this just unconsciously. They naturally tell stories. I had to kind of figure it out because I'm the engineer, and then kind of figure the technique and the framework.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's natural though, Mike. I think that maybe they naturally build rapport, and they might tell some of the stories. I mean, you've got 3 types here: hook, fight, and land stories.
Yeah.
I certainly think that some of the hook stories, yeah, they probably get that, right? I mean, they get their personal story for sure. Maybe a little bit of the insight and success, but the rest, I think, is pretty unnatural, man. So take us through what are those 7 stories so that people can understand them?
The 3 stories that were used to build rapport, and to be clear about this, Phil, rapport building is not just about really telling the story, it's about sharing stories. So if I tell my personal story, which I kind of did a little bit now, how did I get into sales? Probably if I was meeting a client, I would talk more about how did I get into sales training, and how did I mess around before I figured that storytelling, because, I'm a slow learner. The fact that I figured out storytelling doesn't mean that I figured that out for sales training that quickly. I tried to teach a whole lot of other stuff. It's just that storytelling is the easy way to teach salespeople, and everything else is really hard work, because salespeople are so terribly difficult to teach anything, as you might know. I'd probably tell that story more, and then I would say, but Phil, how did you get into being a podcast? How did you get all these crazy guys on your podcast and be so well known? And I listened to Anthony Iannarino, and he says that you're so well known. How did that happen? And get me to tell your story, and then we're exchanging stories, and this is how rapport starts, I believe. Rapport starts by exchanging stories and getting to know each other. And all those books behind me, the sales books, there are about asking questions mostly, and I believe, and that's correct. You need to learn how to ask intelligent questions, but but nobody is answering your question in any depth until they trust you. And it's that interaction that happens before you ask questions that really determines how much they open up and how much they'll to trust. So if you put into your personal story why you should be trusted, some vulnerability to show that you're a human being, that like anyone else you make mistakes, you have good fortune like me, and that you know what you're talking about, right? That you're an authority. That helps to build that trust, and it's a sophisticated thing. This is the hardest story to learn to do well, your personal story. The other two rapport building stories are stories of other people that the buyer will meet. If you're a small company, it might be your CEO, or it might be your head of customer service or your technical sales guy. You can position that person as an authority. They can like them and trust them before they even meet that person. And this is a beautiful technique to help widen that circle of trust. And the third story is your company story. And it always amazes me that most salespeople, when I ask them, they're not really able to tell me the history of how their company started and why it didn't fail and how it succeeded and who is the client that really made their company. What is it that they do? How do they serve? And where are they going? What's their strategy? And that story is incredibly persuasive if told well, but you need to work on it. You need to know how to tell it. So those are the rapport building stories that hook your client, that bind them to you. And of course, you'd like to know their company story as well, or their department if they're a big company. And I'm talking very fast and too much. Does that make sense, Phil?
That absolutely makes sense. And I think that makes so much sense that it's really important that we focus on one piece of that, and that is the purpose of the story, right?
Correct.
The reason that we have a story, because it's not storytelling for storytelling's sake. If you're listening to this, you're thinking, Mike is saying, well, just tell me a story. once upon a time, there were 3 little bears. This is not the type of story we're talking about, right? We're talking about for a purpose. So, Mike, what is that purpose that really kind of underpins these stories?
Yeah, this is some technical things here. I say that there are 5 things that a story has to have. Firstly, it must be a sequence of related events, or it's not a story. So this happened, then that happened, therefore that happened. And a lot of people use the word story and they're not even telling a story. Secondly, it needs to start the right way. You need to have a setting. In 1996, when I moved to Norway, that signals to the audience that I'm telling a true story. And salespeople should always tell true stories, in my opinion. Scrupulously true stories, actually. Don't get caught out pretending that you were the person whose story it happened to, or adding extra stuff, because your client will find out and your credibility is shot. Then it needs to revolve around a central character. If you've been in sales a long time, that'll be you, because you've got lots of war stories. But the true art of sales storytelling is telling other people's stories. And we'll get into that as we go. That's critically important. When you make your story revolve around a central character, your listener can put themselves in the story as that person, so they get the experience of that person, which is the true power of stories. The fourth thing is, so what do I say? So it must be a sequence of related events. It must have a setting, time and a place. It must have a character, and it must make a relevant business point, because you're just time wasting. So the relevant business point at the beginning of the meeting is, you can trust me and I'm an authority and I'm a human, a normal human like you, and let's share stories. The relevant business points as you go into the meeting are that I can offer you a way to change. And there's really 2 stories that do that. Either, and if you think about it actually, Phil, there's only 2 reasons to interrupt a busy business person. And they are either you have worked with another client that is like that person, and you've solved a problem for them, and it could be relevant to them. That we call that a success story. Or your company has some insight into their market, their situation that they should know about that would be valuable, and we call that an insight story. So I'll start with insight stories. That's story number 4, and the way to tell that story is from the perspective of the person that discovered that insight. I call it the researcher's story. I'll give you a quick example if we have time. So back in the early 80s in Perth, in Western Australia, there was a medical researcher. Actually, he was still doing his master's at the Royal Perth Hospital, and he was looking around for a master's project that would be his PhD. And he was directed to a guy called Robin Warren, and they were looking at the causes of stomach ulcers. And Warren had the hypothesis that stomach ulcers were caused by a bacteria. And in those days, the prevailing wisdom was no, stomach ulcers are caused by stress. You may have heard that in the past. Mm-hmm. And so Marshall was like, they were looking to try to get this bacteria in mice, and they couldn't make that work. And no one believed them. And he felt that there was a quick way to solving the problem of credibility around the issue, and that was to give himself an endoscopy, take the bacteria from the stomach of an infected patient, drink it, give himself stomach ulcers, and then take the antibacterium and cure himself. So that was his master's thesis. That's what he wrote up. That paper got a lot of attention, as you can imagine. And in a couple of years later, about 15 years later, 2004, Marshall and Warren won the Nobel Prize for medicine for that discovery. And it's a lovely example of insight because it shows the problem of insight, which is not well understood. You know, we hear about challenger selling, we should challenge our clients. But the problem is, if you truly have insight, if you have something that your client doesn't understand, why are they listening to you? Because they know their business, they think. And if you just go in as a 25-year-old salesperson and say, I know your business and this is my insight, you're probably going to get kicked out, right? So you've got to teach your client how you discovered it. And the researcher's story, like Barry Marshall, the story about how you discovered it and how you got people to listen is the story. And when you put insight into that like that, they listen and they understand. So that's the insight story. The success story is the story about it's a story about a client of yours that was struggling, that had a problem, that met you as your guide. You were the guide. It met you as a credible guide. You gave them a plan, and they avoided failure, and they achieved success. That's a structure of a hero's journey. That's the most complicated story in the 7 stories. It's only got 6 parts to it. You can actually do a story in 3 parts. But that success story, that is what most salespeople need to actually sell a deal. They need that story. But it needs to be in that form. It needs to paint your successful client as the hero because that's the person that your future client will identify. They're not going to identify with you as the character of your story. And most marketers and most salespeople make the critical mistake of painting their company as the hero of the story. And of course, the client can't identify with that, right?
Yeah, well, as you're saying that, I mean, that was that's the biggest thing that you say about all of this. And I would say that's the biggest thing that salespeople miss is my product or service is not the hero. If I'm the salesperson, it is the customer, the way that they implemented it, the fact that they put a great team together, the fact that they got buy-in from the top down, the fact that they had great communication, the fact that they did their homework and selected out of 11 different choices that they picked the one that they knew could meet their needs or that they wrote up great requirements. And then you weave it through that because, of course, we also have to include those problems that they overcome, right? The whole, the hero's journey, heroes don't just happen. They're not heroes because of magic. They overcome an obstacle, right? So I think that's really instructive, Mike. And I think that's really a key thing. Salespeople, if you're listening to this, really go back, rewind about 4 minutes here and just listen to what Mike said there about the success story that shows you as a credible guide, not as the hero, right? You're Yoda, you're not Luke Skywalker.
Absolutely, you're the guide. And if you think about, like you mentioned, the things that your successful client had to do and what they were doing to do, you've got a prescription. And most salespeople know that if their client doesn't do step 1, 2, 3, 4, this thing's going to fail. And if you take a story of a client that nearly didn't do those things or almost failed, those are the better stories, actually. The best success stories are where failure was imminent or nearly happened or did happen and you pulled them out of it and then they succeeded. So you can think of that actually as a way of avoiding the typical objections, because, you know, if you say something like, you know, that client, they thought there's no way they could find funding for this thing, right? But you know, they were brave. They took it to the CEO. We helped them with the business case, and you know, they found the funding through. So what you're doing is you're putting into the story the things that can go wrong and the objections you can overcome, and your future client, your buyer, gets an experience. They get us an experience of what it's like to buy your products and services and how they're going to feel after they've bought it. And it's a beautiful thing, Phil. It's such a beautiful thing when it's done that way.
Well, also, it gives them a taste of how it is to work with you as the salesperson.
Correct. That's right.
I think that's, you know, that's the big thing, right? Because the relationship is not going to be like, if we're selling software, it's not with the implementation team. That relationship is with you as the seller. So you got to be really aware of this here, folks. If you're listening, again, pay attention to that. You got to be the one that acts as the guide, and that's where you can't just turn over this relationship, pitch it over the transom, and expect this is going to work.
Absolutely.
Really work it. So that's marvelous.
You know, you might even say something in the story like, you know, at one stage I was thinking of cutting them loose. You know, the guy wasn't listening to me. You know, he wasn't taking advice. I could see it wouldn't work for them. You know, it's better not to be. I'd rather not sell in that situation, right? But then we got this other guy in. They saw what. So you can actually put into the story the aspects of how you're going to behave going forward, and that's gold. So those are stories 4 and 5. What we're doing here is we're mind changing. We're using stories to change the mind of the buyer and to see a different way of being, of how they can run their business. Then we move into closing the deal. And this is where storytelling for the really good salespeople, this is where they shine. And it's so difficult. If like me, you've been selling high ticket items, the whole thing goes out of your control at a certain point. And I'm sure you've been there, Phil, right? It's like, okay, don't call us. We'll call you. We're thinking about it, right? This can go for months, right? I've got a story in 7 Stories where this went for like 6 months, you know, don't call. We're still thinking about it. And yeah, and you have no idea what's going on, right? You're shut out of this. Probably their CFO is there, their head of risk, head of compliance, there's this stakeholder meeting. You might even know the people there. But what are they talking about? Of course, they're talking about your solution and what it's going to do for them, but they're also talking about risk. What could go wrong? Is this the right use of the company's resources? And someone might say, well, you know, that company, you know, your company, let's call them XYZ. Can we trust them? And if your sponsor has heard what I call the values stories, if you've been able to tell a couple of stories about how your company behaves when things go wrong, just the tone of their voice. I learned this when I worked for Siemens, Phil. You know, Siemens is a massive German multinational conglomerate. It was a 100 billion euro company when I was working for them. It's probably bigger now. And when I joined them, I was used to kind of North American sales culture. You know, we have weekly, we have monthly, and there's like no sales culture in this company. You know, it was CFOs and engineers. And I couldn't work out how anything was sold. And no marketing, no sales. And yet there were these stories, Phil. There were these value stories. I'll give you an example. I was in the country CEO's office, the Australia CEO's office, Albert, and we were having a conversation about a deal that I was working on. And he took a phone call, and you could kind of tell it was serious. He hung it up. He was very subservient in this call. He hung the call up. He said, Mike, that was the Victorian state government. We've got a big problem on a project. We're delivering transformers to this electrical cable that goes from Australia to Tasmania, where I was born, actually, Tasmania, where I grew up, 400 kilometers under the ocean. And the ship bringing the transformers from Germany hit a storm in the Southern Ocean, broke its rudder, and all 6 of these massive transformers are smashed beyond repair. We have to build them again, and it took 18 months to build them. Yeah, exactly. Holy cow. And he said, you know what? I called the Siemens board, They had an emergency meeting. They didn't discuss like litigation or who's liable or who's going to pay for it. They discussed how quickly can we build 6 transformers, and they built them in record time. And the whole project hit its delivery time. There wasn't a single month lost in the entire project, right? Now that's a value story. That's like, can we trust these guys to deliver? The sponsors in that stakeholder meeting are saying, come on, man, this is Siemens. Of course they're going to deliver, because he's heard these stories, right? You hear these stories in the hospitality industry all the time. The lost wallet on the counter, and the bellboy takes it out to the airport and doesn't want to reward. And how does your company behave ethically? What kind of company are you? These stories are incredibly persuasive, and not only to the client, but internally to your own organization as well. And that's the story of a leader, in my case, the Siemens chairman of the Siemens board, but the leader doing the right thing for the customer. And those are brilliant stories. And the final story, the 7th story, I call the sales manager story. And that's like the guy that has closed deals before and knows how to do it. And Phil, when we get to big deals, not too many people close big deals all the time. It's a few people actually. And those people have amazing stories. And if you ever go to negotiation skills class, they are story after story after story, because the people who know how to negotiate big deals, they're incredible storytellers. And their stories really teach. And in this context, this is the story that teaches your sponsor how to get around a stuck situation, right? So you've got that stakeholders meeting, that sort of 6 to 10 people who aren't sure. So there are all sorts of standard problems that happen. If we have a couple of minutes, I'll give you one example from my own experience. I was working on a big music media deal with a media company about 10 years ago. And this thing was a revenue share. This was a little bit like Apple iTunes before iTunes. It was in the mid-2000s. And the media company was only going to make money if there was lots of downloads, and we were only going to make money if there were lots of downloads. And it was a complicated system. And we got into the contract negotiation. And until then, I'd been working with all their technical people and their commercial people. And then they invited us to this contract negotiation that was up on the top floor of the corporate towers, massive big table, and there's all the client people on one side of the table. I knew them, and all of my technical experts on the other side. And at the head of the table was this new guy that we hadn't met, and he was the chief negotiator. And he proceeded to just pull the deal apart. The reliability had to be 99.999%, and it didn't like the financial terms. And I'm thinking, man, like, this is not a revenue share. This is just like a pillage of the supplier, And I remember walking back to my office, which was about half a kilometer away, and went into the office, and one of the more experienced sales guys saw my face and said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Yeah, we're not going to close this deal because, this guy's just, there's making an ambit claim, and then there's this guy, right?" And he said a beautiful thing. He said, "Mike, why don't you just go around and have a chat with him?" And I hadn't even thought of the possibility, and I thought, okay. So I rang him up, and I spent 2 hours in his office explaining that deal to him, and he didn't have a clue. He didn't understand the deal at all. And then we went back into negotiation a few days later, and he was the same character. In role, he was the same hard ass, right? But he carefully skirted around all the non-negotiable issues. And a couple of meetings later, we closed the deal, and it was the first system for my company worldwide for that media download. And we closed the deal. And I really learned something, right, from another person that knew how to do it. And that's the teaching story. That's the teaching story that helps you get around typical problems in deal negotiation. And that's the 7 stories through the buying cycle.
Fantastic. So, Mike, I'm convinced we need stories. Hopefully our listeners are too, but here's the thing, right? This has got to be a lot of work. I mean, this has got to take, hundreds of hours a week in order to do this? I mean, you got to be a special case to do this, don't you?
Look, my book is directed at sales leaders, people who run a business, have a team of salespeople. And there's a little bit of engineering system to think about. you need to think about a story library and start collecting your stories. Most companies have these stories. All it takes is to get the team together, teach them a little bit about the structure, and then set them off. And then as they tell stories, I just get my iPhone out, Phil. I just record them as they're telling them, hold the iPhone there, boom, I've got a 2-3 minute video, put it in the story library. So you can start to build up these stories very quickly. We use iPhone for a video. We use WhatsApp for practice. So I'll call the sales guy up and say, look, tell me that success story, but get it under 2 minutes and send me a WhatsApp video. What they'll do is they won't send it. They'll listen to it. They'll see that it's 3 minutes. They'll try again. They'll try again. They'll try again. Before you know it, the guy spent 40 minutes practicing, and then they send you a 2-minute video. And this is how people learn quite quickly how to do it, Phil. And so, no, it's not that time consuming. It's something that salespeople enjoy. Instead of teaching them the latest complicated process or your CRM, teach them storytelling when you get them together for the sales kickoff. And the experienced guys will love it because they'll be telling the stories. The young guys will love it because they'll be hearing those stories. And the sales leader can start collecting them up and putting them in a story library. And this works brilliantly.
That makes so much sense, and that's such good stuff there, Mike. I mean, if you practice, if you care enough to do a story, you care enough to do it right. And
Correct.
That's where the practice comes in. So you mentioned WhatsApp and you mentioned your iPhone. I'm going to give you one more tool that might help speed that up even more, and that is otter.ai. Otter will transcribe your story in real time, so you can then see the words. Instead of just practicing it, you can see the words and rewrite your script, so you get even tighter on that messaging so that you can really get quick. I use that when I'm training sales folks, and it's just a terrific tool. So you combine those three, and now you got some really good stuff.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And, I use a bit of an iteration between written and spoken when I'm preparing. So if I had to write 7 stories, obviously I had to write the book.
Yep.
But it's interesting. The written story is good, and the sales guys need the background, because it's no good telling a success story and the client says, well, tell me about this exact thing, and they can't tell the next question. They can't answer the next question. They still need the case study background, right? So that's written. But I generally find that the video, listening to the video and then just having a go, telling it in their own words, makes for a more natural story. Oral storytelling is not quite the same as the written story. You actually need both for the structure of the story library. But yeah, I'll put in the show notes for your listeners a link to our story library so they can just jump in and read some stories. And then of course the 7 Stories book has 50 stories in it.
Awesome. That's fantastic, Mike. We'll definitely do that. So if there's anything else that we can give folks as they want to get started on their story journey, what would be 1 or 2 things right now that a salesperson could do if they don't have any story library yet and they don't have anything at all? How would they get started?
Yeah, for a young salesperson, look, the book is $2.99, so that's a pretty cheap investment, I think. So read the book, or even if you don't like to read a book from end to end, you can just dip into the stories, because I made the stories so that they're kind of indented. So you can just jump and read the stories if you want to. So that will give you an idea of what the story is. And then just go and talk to the seasoned salespeople, to your boss, and just ask them to tell me. Instead, I know that these are our top clients, but who sold them to me? And can you tell me the story of what actually happened? And don't leave out the bad bits. Tell me all the things that went wrong as well. And then you'll start to hear those stories, and if you've got that structure that I give in the book, you'll get there. So once you know how powerful they are, then of course you go seeking them out. And that's exactly what I did when I had to change industry those times. I was seeking them out. Most companies don't have them prepared. It's a very rare company actually that has a story library.
Awesome. Well, hopefully, folks, if you're listening here, you get started capturing those stories, get started building your library, and get started telling all the 7 stories that Every Salesperson Must Tell. So Mike, if people, obviously they can go to Amazon, get a copy of the book, but if they wanted to ask you some more questions, they want to go deeper with you, which social channel would you send them, or how would you get them to you so they can interact with you more?
Yeah, look, I'm really active on LinkedIn. I'm just starting to experiment with Instagram, but don't go there yet. That I will do that. But I'm active on YouTube. So I have a YouTube channel. I put all my stories there. The stories in our online training, I test them out on YouTube. We put them into the online training. So yeah, I'll give you the link for that too, because we have story training that you can take online, which comes with coaching from Mike via that WhatsApp messaging. So people can do that too. I'll send you the link for that too.
Awesome. That sounds great. So folks, if you're looking to get started with your stories, I encourage you, take a peek at this book. As Mike said, $2.99 on the Kindle. I've got a hard copy here, 7 stories every salesperson must tell. Mike Adams is the guy. Check him out. Find him on LinkedIn. Listen to him and get started telling your stories. Doesn't matter what you're doing. Mike's your guy. So Mike, thank you so much for spending time with us today. You're the best, dude.
Good on you. There's an audiobook too if people like to listen.
There you go.
I've actually been amazed at how well the audiobook's going. It seems like it gets about double the downloads as the paperback books. It's really surprised me.
Yeah. Well, I think it's your accent. I think that's
Mike Bosworth on the intro as well. He does a nice.
There you go. Yeah. Exactly. Cool. Well, check it out, folks. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. Have a great day.
Good on you. It's been a delight. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Mike.